I'm Don Smith, Executive Director of the West Virginia Press Association, and this is our legislative leadership presentation from noon to 1:30. And we're going to have addresses by Senate President Mitch Carmichael from Jackson County and Speaker of the House Roger Hanshaw from Clay County. They will discuss what they see as the upcoming session issues and where they hope to see things go. And then we will open it for questions, and the media moderators with their questions. Dave Mistich of West Virginia Public Broadcasting will join me, and we'll do a round of questions. But then we will open it up to all of you, which we think is the key. A lot of you want to have questions. So we will, as we have in the past, Dave will have a mic, and we'll come around and take your questions to the Speaker and the President. And with that, I want to just again recognize, as always, our corporate sponsors, WVU and AARP West Virginia. Thank you guys for that. And I'll go to my immediate left, and Senator Carmichael, you can take the podium here or there, whichever. I think the podium would be better for opening.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Don, and Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be with you as we begin another legislative session. And I think it's important to take just a moment to look back on the past several years, 4 years, and see how far we've come as a legislature, as a state, as a society in the past several years. And just to count our blessings. This has been an amazing run of success in the state of West Virginia over the past several years, and it's due, I believe, in large measure to the change in policy direction that the state legislature has brought forth. We have made enormous fundamental changes to the manner in which we construct our economy in our state. And the markers are undeniable of the success. We have been ranked as just a couple of markers, first in personal income growth in the second quarter of 2018, first quarter of 2019. We've had the highest employment in West Virginia, the highest total employment since the year 2008. Our personal income tax collections are up, our consumer sales tax collections are up, our state revenue tax collections are up 16% in 3 years. We put West Virginia back to work. We protected life, liberty in our state. We made enormous contributions in this area. We funded our roads. Our tourism growth is growing exponentially. We've reduced regulations, and we have improved the judicial climate in West Virginia. Those are just a few of the many markers of our success over the past several years. And I look out across the audience and the press and others that are here and think, this story needs to be told not just in West Virginia, but throughout America. The change that is occurring in our state is invigorating, it's inspirational, and it's making a real difference in the lives and the outcomes of the state, of the people of this state. And it feels great to be a part of that time in this resurgence of West Virginia. And so the many things that we're doing aren't always easy, and I love the hard stuff. It's the easy stuff gets done, anybody can do it, right? But when we get to things that are tough, that create sort of conflict in our state, and change becomes hard. But it's absolutely necessary. If we're going to move this state forward, we have to have, and it's not, all of us have to have the courage and the determination and the fortitude to take the tough stances that will move our state forward. And we've all known what these things are. We know what needs to be done, and there's not been in the past the political will to implement those changes. That changed, and we're in a position that we're going to do everything we can do to help the people of West Virginia. The citizens that live in these little white houses throughout our hills and valleys of our state deserve a world-class education, a world-class economy, a world-class transportation system. And so we're focused on doing those things. I just wanted to take a brief moment and look back a couple of years so that you can reflect upon where we were and now where we are currently and where we're heading. We have so much more that we intend to do in this upcoming legislative session, and I just want to point out a couple of our agenda items that will be focused upon. And we always categorize it in several different areas so that makes the reporting easy. We talk about jobs or economic development. We talk about our roads and transportation system. We talk about our education system, and then our healthcare delivery system as it relates to the terrible epidemic of opioid addiction in our state and the resulting effect on our children. I mean, we have 7,000 children that are need foster care in our state. And there's a great article today in the lead editorial in the Gazette about the foster care crisis in our state. And those things should inspire us, fracture our soul, really. When you see these things and you hear these stories, it should touch us at a very deep level such that we make the policy decisions and the funding streams available to solve these problems for our children. But as we look at economic development, I continue to contend that the best social program is a job. And so we want to focus on eliminating the barriers that have stopped job creation in our state. Things like the personal property tax on business or manufacturing machinery and equipment. It's been identified, and you all, the people that have been here for very long know, for over 30 years people have been talking about getting rid of this tax. And it's been identified by renowned economists. It's been studied by governors from both parties. And that it always comes back, this is the #1 job-killing tax in the state. And yet, it still remains 30 to 40 years after the studies have been conducted. We want to be the legislature that gets rid of it and creates the manufacturing jobs and opportunities for our state to continue to grow in those areas. And I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights, and I'm sure there's others that'll have questions. But in terms of our judicial system, we want an intermediate court of appeals. And we're the largest state in America that does not have an intermediate court of appeals. And it's, you talk about job creation and big business. It's a check mark for those big entities that look to say, do I have an absolute right to appeal in the state that I want to conduct business, and will I get a fair judicial hearing? We want to ensure that check gets marked for West Virginia, Intermediate Court of Appeals. We want to, in terms of our health care delivery system, continue to focus on foster care delivery. Speaker Hanshaw has worked very hard on that. Last year, we brought forth some foster care reform initiatives, but we want to continue to do more in that area. There's so much more that we can do, and we want to really work. I'm afraid sometimes that there are so many different programs that are available that they're not cohesively coordinated. So we want to make sure that we're delivering these services in a very efficient manner and making sure that those who need these services get timely, effective delivery of them. And then in education, I just want to report to you just another great marker in terms of our Senate Bill 1 last year, delivering community and technical college education to our to any West Virginian that wants to achieve a higher level of training, certification, or an associate degree. One of the most critical markers that we have in our state that indicates we need to do better is our workforce participation rate. It's among, if not, the lowest in the country. And when we look at that, how do you solve that problem? Because if we get our people, those people who are eligible to work in the workforce, our economy expands exponentially. And we have money to do so many other things. So that's a very critical marker for us. And we want to make sure that the people that are not in the workforce have the proper skills, training, and ability to have a marketable skill to take to the marketplace. Now, the great point about Senate Bill 1 last year is that just since its implementation in June, there have been, I've got the exact numbers on that for you. There have been 2,367 applications for this West Virginia Invest program. other words, people that can come to the community and technical college system, get an associate's degree or certification in welding, electric, some other disciplines. Over 2,367. Of that, 1,000 received West Virginia help money, state taxpayer money. 1,300 or 1,345 received no state assistance. It was all federal funding. Because we put a requirement in place that you apply for all that federal funds that are available, then they've drawn down that amount of money. So you think about it, just in this short amount of time, over 2,300 people are working towards a higher degree, a higher certification, additional training that will help them make a better life for their family and contribute to the economy in West Virginia. And realize, we put in place a provision in that bill that requires the recipient to live and work in West Virginia for a period of 2 years or pay the loan back. So it becomes a loan instead of a grant. It's a great win-win-win for the people of West Virginia, the state economy, and the future families that will be changed by the additional training that they're receiving. So we're doing so much good in our state. And I know there are those that, and it's appropriate, we should find where we're not doing the right things and fix it. But I hope you come away with, from my remarks, by knowing that when we find something that's not working in West Virginia, we'll move heaven and earth to fix it. Because we don't calculate the political cost. We calculate what's right for the people of West Virginia. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be in this role for this moment in time. And thank you, and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you. Hold the applause.
Well, folks, good afternoon. We just came through a Christmas season. We're into a new year now. And it's this time of the year, each year, that members of the legislature typically begin getting asked about what's in store for the upcoming session, where things are likely to go, how we got where we are, what was left undone from last year, what likely is to be the agenda items to be taken up in January. And those are good questions from all around our state. Questions from areas of our state that are growing and doing well, questions from areas of our state that have experienced a bit of economic difficulty over the course of the last decade and generation, arguably. And it's a pleasure to talk about those things because Senator Carmichael is right. There is much work to be done. There remains a lot to be done in the pursuit of making West Virginia the best place to locate your business, the place we want people from all across the country and around the world to come. If you ask most members of the legislature, and I see a number of our House and Senate colleagues here today from both parties, if you ask most members of the legislature why she or he ran for office, if you ask any member of the legislature why he or she ran for office, I think you're likely to hear some version of the following. Well, I ran for the House or Senate because I wanted to make I wanted to make it easier for my children and grandchildren to stay here, to grow up here, to raise their families here the same way that I did. And that means different things to different people. For a lot of folks, it means making it easier to start your small business here and expand a business that's existing here. For some folks, it means making it the easiest possible place to retire. But regardless of what it means to you or to whomever the questioner is, I think there's a shared consensus that we all want to make the choice of West Virginia as easy as we can make it. We all want to make West Virginia the easiest place to choose in the country. And that hasn't always been the case. We're all honest enough with each other here to know that for generations, for time well preceding the life and tenure of anyone here, or for that matter, anyone in the legislature now, things that needed to be done weren't getting done, and they need to be done now. Regardless of how we got where we are, it makes no difference how we got where we are. I think it's pointless to ask that question. All that does matter is what needs to be done now, and how do we work together to fix it. My personal priority as a member of this legislature, as long as I've been here, has always been economic growth and economic development. I come from an area of our state that falls into that bucket that I mentioned in my opening comments about having some economic struggles over the course of the last generation. There's lots of work to be done there. There's lots of work to be done, changes that need to happen, steps that need to be taken that haven't always been taken. Let me start through some things that I believe we are likely to take up in the House as we convene next week. It was a great day, and I was proud to be among the votes cast in favor of Senate Bill 1 when the House passed that bill last session. That bill is already providing an opportunity for West Virginians who want to enter the workforce and want to fill economic needs that have gone unmet to do so, to get the training and skills to do so. But what we also know is that depending upon where you are in the state, depending upon where you live and where you want to work, access to the training itself may be a problem. Access to the training itself may be a problem. It's not always easy for a person who is already in an established family situation that wants to make a career change or wants to seek some additional training to pick up roots and move to a place that would be eligible for the kind of opportunity that Senate Bill 1 provides. So I think there is some interest among members of the House in expanding the scope of how we offer those programs. Can we let those programs be offered at four-year institutions that want to get in the business of offering additional training to West Virginians? Can we broaden the scope of opportunity that institutions are able to provide to our citizens? Right now, our law doesn't provide that. Our law restricts the programs that institutions of higher education can offer. We have an interest in evaluating whether that's still appropriate. Is it still appropriate in this economy and this environment today that we have the educational regulatory structure that we have? Do we want to allow our four-year institutions of higher education to begin to do more? Do we want to let down some of the barriers that are preventing our schools in more remote parts of West Virginia from offering those kind of trade-based programs that Senate Bill 1 was designed to provide? For many of us, the answer is yes. For many of us who represent more rural parts of our state, we'd like to see those programs offered and made available to people who don't necessarily have the chance to pack up their families and move somewhere else. We all want those people back on a payroll. That's all of our objectives. Everyone shares the objective of getting those people back on a payroll. So I think there's movement and interest in advancing the scope of Senate Bill 1 and asking how do we make it available to more people. Likewise, there is significant interest in the House in looking at our overall system of what we call occupational licensing here in West Virginia. It turns out that, if I'm remembering the data correctly, West Virginia is considered to be the 44th most regulated environment in West Virginia for regulated occupations. And by regulated occupations, I mean the number of things for which one needs a license, the number of professions or occupations for which one needs a license to practice that profession from the state of West Virginia. We think it's time to evaluate whether that's still appropriate. We all know that things in legislation develop for a reason. We all know that every law that was passed is usually founded upon something that made absolute perfect sense at the time. Laws enacted by the legislature make absolute sense at the time because they're often designed to address a particular need. But sometimes that need goes away. And when the need goes away, sometimes the law should go away. And we're actively engaged now in asking which, if any, of those regulated professions should go away. For which of those professions should West Virginians simply be able to hold out a shingle and begin offering their services in the communities? Likewise, we're interested in whether an individual here in our state has gotten a particular training or received a particular license or certification from a neighboring state or the military, and whether that person is able and authorized to practice his or her profession here in our state on that license. In other words, expanded reciprocity of licensing and occupational licensing reform. That is a priority for us. We know that many of the places in our state where the opportunity gap exists and many of the parts of West Virginia in which unemployment still remains high are places that need to be served by people in that what we call mid-skills gap. Folks who are anxious to go to work, who are willing to go to work, who want to get back on a payroll, but for some regulatory reason aren't able to do that. That's a priority for the House. We've been looking at occupational licensing reform all throughout the interim session this summer. Our staff and our members of our House Government Organizations Committee have taken that charge very seriously and have already begun the process of asking what, if any, occupational licensing reform can we do to put people back on a payroll in West Virginia immediately. We also know that getting people on a payroll and letting people get up and go to work requires, from time to time, some change in our regulatory structure in terms of our criminal code and our criminal law here in West Virginia. We've taken some steps with our Senate colleagues over the course of the last couple of years in making some second chance opportunities available to people who have done the right thing, who have served their time, who've paid their dues to society, and are simply wanting to get back on a payroll now. We want to make sure that we've done the right thing there, that we're actually empowering men and women to get back on a payroll. And sometimes that takes the form of things that that aren't always obvious to many of us. For example, driver's license in specific. We know that we have over 60,000 West Virginians who are without a driver's license today. That's a significant portion of our population. And because we live where we do, because we in West Virginia live where we do, people have to drive to work. People simply have to get up each morning, get in a car, and drive to work. And when we have a judicial process, or perhaps an administrative process, let me be clear, this isn't always a judicial problem. Sometimes it's an administrative problem. When you have a judicial or administrative problem that prevents men and women from getting a driver's license and getting themselves eligible again to get in a car and drive to work, that's a problem for all of us because it keeps those men and women off the payroll. We have an interest in looking at that this session, along with some additional review of our comprehensive bail and bond legislation here in West Virginia. We know that our counties are struggling under crippling jail bills. We know that our counties are simply unable to provide certain kinds of basic services in the communities of our state because they're spending huge amounts of money, tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, paying jail bills. But yet we learned in our interim process last month that over 50% of the population of our regional jails is made up of men and women awaiting trial. Over half of the money that's being spent by counties in our state to incarcerate our citizens is being spent on men and women who are awaiting trial. So we're going to look at that this session. We're going to ask questions about whether it's appropriate that we use our facilities in that way, whether we use our bail and bond statutes in the way that we are, or whether we explore a different mechanism to make sure those people actually appear at trial. We don't want to be squandering resources that we already don't have if there are better ways to do it. I think many of us share Senate President Carmichael's view of the Intermediate Court of Appeals and have begun to consider what, if any, version of that the House would like to advance this session. We know that our federal system operates a judiciary in a slightly different way than we have here in West Virginia. We know that in the federal system there are administrative processes that advance their way from the administrative agency, not to the trial courts, but to the courts of appeal. Not to the trial courts, but to the courts of appeal. And while that may seem a bit wonkish or a bit inside baseball for the general population, to those folks who are a member of one of those regulated communities, where if you are a citizen who faces some kind of action by a regulatory agency, getting that process resolved as quickly as possible is an important day in your life. Getting that process to conclusion as quickly as you can get it there is an important day in your life. Many of us who work in and around the legal system take for granted what it's like to appear before a judge. We take for granted what it means to go to court, what it means to interact with the judiciary. Realize that isn't the case for most West Virginians. If you are the average West Virginian or the average business owner or the average employee or worker out here in our state, if you find yourself before a court, that is a big day in your life. If you find yourself in front of a judge, that is a big day in your life. And we need to make sure that men and women and our citizens have access to the courts and are able to get their cases heard and resolved, not just heard, but resolved as quickly as possible. So we have an interest in looking at the structure of an Intermediate Court of Appeals and whether it fills a function more akin to the federal system in terms of resolving regulatory and administrative appeals, the same way the federal government does. And lastly, we know that all the improvements that we have made here in West Virginia and all the things that we know that we want to do and all the things that Senate President Carmichael and I have stood at this and many other podiums and described are meaningless if the quality of life for our citizens here in West Virginia isn't also improving. We know that the step we took last year in advancing foster care legislation through the House and Senate and seeing that bill enacted into law was an important first step. We know that bill did good things to move our foster system forward, but we also know that there's more work to be done there in making sure that some of our most vulnerable citizens are cared for, that some of the most vulnerable people in our society, young children, are actually cared for and cared for appropriately and cared for by men and women who can provide a good home into which those foster children can go when they're in the care of the state. Our health committee's already begun looking at that. They spent much of the summer and the fall working on additional foster care legislation. We've done that together with our Senate colleagues, and I expect that you'll see that advance in the House and hopefully through the Senate again when we convene next week. Likewise, our flooding committee, created as a statutory committee of this legislature just a couple years ago, has been very active over the course of the summer and the fall, advancing legislation that we'll take up for consideration next week. some of which will create a state resiliency office. We know that we have a number of organizations and entities of state government charged with providing administrative and on-the-ground services to communities and towns and people who find themselves in a disaster situation. But what's lacking and what we've found is that there's not as much coordination among those services and entities and agencies as we would like, and as may be appropriate to get those problems solved quickly and clear the books of those problems for the people who just need to get their lives back in order. We will advance a bill this session that's based around creating a state resiliency office that's designed to actually do those functions, that's designed to make sure we are properly prepared to deal with disasters when they occur. We talk about flooding in that committee a lot because here in West Virginia, given the geography that we have as a state, it floods. We all live through those. You all report those stories, and we the citizens and you the citizens live through those flooding events seemingly every year. But we know that other kinds of natural disasters here happen too, and when they do, response is important, and a timely response is very important. We're in a position now where we expect the State Resiliency Office to do exactly that. We will, every year that we have the opportunity, look at whether we are doing as much as we can do to advance broadband expansion and deployment in West Virginia. I've said at podiums just like this, in fact, maybe this very podium before, that broadband expansion is to the 21st century what the interstate highway system was to the 20th century. It's how we do commerce now. It's how we move the economy. It's the manner in which we as West Virginians and Americans and citizens of the world engage one another in commerce. We need to be absolutely certain that we're doing everything we can to clear the way for broadband expansion here in our state. Our Committee on Technology and Infrastructure has begun work on that, on our newest version of a broadband expansion bill this year to address some regulatory changes that have been promulgated by the Federal Communications Commission and other federal agencies over the course of the last year. We expect to move that bill this year. We're also excited to say that that bill and other ideas like it will be coming out of our new technology caucus in the House. So I hope that you've seen by now we've announced the formation of a bipartisan technology caucus in the House, chaired jointly by Delegates Moore Capito and Sean Fluharty. Those delegates have already begun work on crafting an agenda for bills designed to make West Virginia the most hospitable place we can make it for tech companies. You know, if a technology company leaves Silicon Valley and outsources somewhere domestically, the #1 place it goes is Boulder, Colorado. If a tech company leaves Silicon Valley, the most likely place it is to go in America is Boulder, Colorado. If you look around about why that might be true and ask that question about why it might be true, you find that it's outdoor recreation. It's outdoor recreation. The people who work in those industries are drawn to outdoor recreation opportunities, and we have those opportunities here. We have outdoor recreation opportunities here in abundance, and we're all proud of them. We talk about them every day, and we often take them for granted because we live here and we see them every day. We this year are hoping to do as much as possible to strengthen the work of the Tourism Office. That's not a legislative priority, it's a budgetary priority, but it's nevertheless worth mention because we know that our return on investment in tourism dollars is a positive return. We know that it does good things for our state when people outside our borders look in on West Virginia and say that this looks like a neat place to spend some time. This looks like a place where I'd like to go to ski, to whitewater raft, to hike, to bike, to fish, to hunt. All those things that we take for granted here as West Virginians. There are a number of things that you'll see beyond that. I'll stop now and say that I'll end the way I began. For almost every member of the House and Senate, the reason we ran for the legislature in the first place was to make the choice of West Virginia just a little bit easier. That's what you'll see us working on when we convene next week. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President. The way this will work is Dave and I will have some questions, and we'll open this up to the panel, and we'll give you more time than we take. One of the questions that came up earlier, and I want to ask it again of this group, and West Virginia, as we talk, we have the government has limited resources to put towards these things, but you want to be as effective as possible. The areas, some of the worst areas in our state facing the toughest economic challenges have the least potential, and maybe that's why they're in that situation. How does the House and the Senate and the leadership view this? How are you going to look at using those resources? Are you going to look at the low-hanging fruit in the areas that have the greatest potential? Or are you going to look at maybe with the area where the greatest need is. And those two aren't necessarily the same. So as your committees are meeting and your leadership teams are meeting, how is that balancing act done? And you can use there or the mic, either one is fine.
If it's okay, I'll just sit here and just answer very briefly in that government's role is relatively limited, or should be relatively limited. We should allow prosperity to occur in those areas that are well positioned to do so for the market conditions of that time and moment. For instance, the Eastern Panhandle is prospering. There are things in north central West Virginia as relates to oil and gas, and the Northern Panhandle. Jackson County was the fastest growing county in America, under 100,000 people for this past year from a gross county product perspective. So, and then as it relates to, I'm assuming you're referring to southern West Virginia or maybe some other areas in very remote parts of West Virginia. We need our cities to grow. Our cities must grow in order to, you look across America, that's where a lot of the growth is really occurring. And we want it to grow, and we want to take care of our, the other areas as well, but we want to, and I maybe take a little bit of exception. I know you probably didn't mean it this way, to say they have less potential. They have incredible potential, but they have to find their niche. Spencer has a wonderful, I see my friend here, and they have a wonderful arts community, and they're doing other things as it relates to oil and gas industry. And so every place has a unique economic advantage that they need to capitalize on, and the state can play a role in it. But in many ways, we need to level the playing field and ensure that the resources are allocated in a way that is not politically motivated to a politically powerful person, or so to speak, but more made on pure economic decisions. So,
let me jump in that. Don, if I understood your question, it at least in part related to what process gets used for determining how and when and if the state of West Virginia interjects itself in the process and does things through our development officer or Department of Commerce. And I'll tell you my personal philosophy on that would be that we get the most return and achieve the best objective when we help those people and those communities in those areas which are already trying to help themselves. The old adage is about leading the horse to water but not being able to make it drink. Those areas which are already working hard themselves to try and do things to develop their own economies, oftentimes just need a little push, just need a little help, just need a little advancement from the state. And that's where things like site preparation can come into play. It's where things like helping broadband cooperatives form in areas where the local communities have already come together and done the legwork to say, we need a broadband cooperative here, we want to form one, we just don't know how to do it. Can you help us, can you, the Broadband Council, for example, help us form a broadband cooperative? Well, the answer is yes. And that can happen whether we're talking about one forming in Morgantown or Welch. That can happen in any place in which the citizens are already coming together to help themselves. Now, that's just as true in terms of economic development type activities. Capital has a way of finding the place where it needs to go. If markets are left to function, capital has a way of finding the places where it needs to go. And different kinds of investments look for different kinds of criteria. Some look for population centers, and as the president said, we need to make sure that Charleston, Morgantown, Huntington, Martinsburg, all of our cities, all the others that we didn't name there also are growing and thriving and have a chance to grow and thrive. But realize not all industrial development looks for those kind of environments. Sometimes the industrial facility, if it is an industrial facility, wants to be located 5 miles from the nearest population center for security reasons. Other times it needs to be located in places where there's adequate infrastructure, where there's adequate electricity and natural gas. So in communities where there's already momentum and there's already interest in the local community for doing the work and advancing the projects at the local level themselves, and they just need a little help from the state, those are the areas in which I think we do the most good by helping people who are already trying at whatever level to help themselves.
I want to stick with the economy a little bit. We've heard a lot about this business inventory equipment tax, the repeal that's been up for the past couple of years, and the conversation seems to continue. My question, there's a series of them for the both of you. What is the amount of that revenue that you guys are targeting this year? What exactly would those that lost revenue come from? What specifically, as far as equipment, what types of industries would be getting that break? And I know, Mr. President, you and I have talked about how that the makeup in that revenue could be from natural economic growth, but with the budget being sluggish, how can we anticipate that to be the case?
Okay, great question. I'm going to unpack it a little bit because you talk about the total impact of manufacturing, personal property tax on manufacturing equipment and inventory is $100 million, just slightly less than $100 million. Now, if you contemplate phasing that out over a 4-year period, let's just pick a number, that's $25 million a year. Now, the budget this past year that's in place spent roughly $230 million of one-time funding, one-time expenditures, $100 million for PEIA and roughly $130 for additional maintenance for our highway system. That's one-time money that would, if we kept the same revenue numbers, which it looks like we're going to be on that same revenue stream, we will have approximately $200 million surplus. So that's money that hasn't been spent this year that was, or wouldn't have been spent next year that was spent this year. So that in itself, if you wanted to do away with it year one, would take care of it. That's not the contemplate. We're contemplating a phase out of this tax in which manufacturers can now look at West Virginia and comparing it to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and say, we're on a level playing field. We're heading in that direction in West Virginia. Because if you expand, and Jackson County is a perfect example of this, that Kaiser aluminum plant that was a great economic engine for our state, 4,000 one-time employees. And the investment to create that type of a manufacturing facility is taxed every year. And just right across the river, you could throw a rock almost across the Ohio River, it wouldn't be taxed. That is an enormous, enormous difference in the economic viability of a plant. And we have to join together to get our state on a level playing field and let us compete on a level playing field with these other states, because we deserve those jobs. We deserve those revenue streams from those manufacturing entities. So that's how we would do it, Dave. We would do it by phasing it out, incorporating the natural growth of the budget, and then ensuring that the expenditures that we've had in our past years can be monitored more efficiently. For instance, this $230 million I just spoke of, that will be excess if we don't do those same expenditures in the new year. So the money's there to do it. We just have to have the will to do it and ensure that the counties and the boards of education are comfortable that that revenue stream will continue to come to them.
I don't have a lot to add to that, except to say this: there are ways to achieve various economic goals differently, right? And our Sunday school lesson on Sunday this past week, the devotion said, do as much good as you can, as often as you can, however you can. And that approach, I think, needs to be taken when we talk about economic development. We need as much growth as we can, wherever we can get it, however we can get it. So the governor's office, for example, I know has proposed a statutory mechanism specifically geared towards the petrochemical industry. We're aggressively recruiting petrochemical manufacturers and petrochemical companies here to West Virginia. We are taking steps every year, in fact every day, at the executive branch agency level to make West Virginia a competitive playing field for the recruitment of petrochemical companies and downstream uses of natural gas in manufacturing environments. We want to do those things. We'll also probably be considering the governor's proposal for a statutory approach to dealing with that specific narrow exception for the petrochemical industry in an effort to do absolutely as much as we can, however we can, wherever we can, to recruit those industries to our state.
I'd like to go more to the quality of life and social aspects. You both had mentioned in different ways, Mr. President, you mentioned the Second Chance program and trying to do that. And Mr. Speaker, you talked about the driver's license issue with the DUI. And there have been some unique approaches across the country and some unique opinions. Oklahoma had a release of people that they said that we're going to reclassify these offenses and let you out of jail because we had you in there for 10 years for smoking marijuana or whatever. So they just literally said time served, let you go. Other people have talked about when the DUI is someone gets arrested for drunk driving and you take their license so they can't drive, but they can still drink. Why not let them keep their license and put a big A on it so they can't buy alcohol? But there are different things. But both of these take people out of society, out of the workforce, and make them hard for them to function. Is your goal to reduce the number of people facing that in West Virginia or to streamline the process this year? Next year, will you say there are fewer people incarcerated in West Virginia because of this, or this is the system we have that will keep people from becoming incarcerated?
Well, both. We want a system in place that expedites those who have been convicted and are currently sitting in jail. We want those people expedited back into the workforce. And the Speaker talked about it. We've made second chance opportunities more prevalent in West Virginia. We also want to recognize that the recidivism rate for just releasing people from prison or from these treatment facilities and so forth is very high. And so we need to take efforts to ensure that they have some training and skill sets so that when they leave, obtain their complete freedom, that they just don't fall back into that behavior, and that they have a skill set that gets them out of the previous way of life and allows them to make a living and contribute to society. So your question is well framed, and I'm not sure I have all the answers to that at the moment, but what I will say is we are very interested in second chance opportunities and in expediting the release of prisoners in a manner that ensures that they've paid their debt to society, but gets them productive again for society. And then having fewer people, we want to lock up the people that are a real danger to our society and not the ones that we just don't agree with. And so that'll be our sort of theology as we look at it. But there's a lot of different forms in which I can take.
There's some subtleties to this too. So, for example, I hesitate to use the word prisoner because to me that connotes someone who has been sentenced. That to me implies someone who has been sentenced to a term of incarceration. Over half of the men and women that we are housing in our facilities in West Virginia haven't been sentenced to anything. They are awaiting trial, and that rolls at whatever the jail bill fee is per county every month on our counties. So if I heard the question right, we were talking about, or the question I think used the term letting people out. Well, that does not necessarily mean letting people out of a sentence. So, for example, if over half of the people that we're housing haven't been sentenced to anything, maybe there's a better and cheaper and more effective way to make sure those people actually appear for trial than continuing to house them at the rate of the daily jail bill on the backs of each of our counties. So maybe it is appropriate that those men and women come out of those facilities while they're waiting for their trial. But that's not to say that we're going to release sentences or cut back on sentences. Those people have been true prisoners who have actually been sentenced to a term of incarceration, have been found in a court of law guilty of a crime. And I think we all agree that if crimes are committed, punishment is appropriate. But one of the things that we're also interested in at the level of the House is making sure that over time we have not evolved the criminal code incorrectly. So, for example, it has been a long time since we have done a full codification or recodification of our criminal code. We're interested in a full review of our drug statutes, our criminal drug statutes in West Virginia. I see Delegate Roger is here as chair of our Committee on Substance Abuse. We've had these conversations about whether we have evolved our criminal statutes correctly over the course of time, especially as it relates to drug offenses. In my opening comments, I remarked that oftentimes legislation happens in a reactionary manner. We adopt legislation in response to specific incidents or to deal with specific problems that make their way to our attention or to the headlines in our state and national media. That's good, and we need to do that when it's appropriate, but we also need to make sure we don't get out of step. We need to make sure that we haven't made the more heinous crime less of a punishment than the more pedestrian crime. So all of those things go together in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here. I realize that's a long-winded answer to the question, but it's thank you.
I'm going to stick with social issues here. This came up earlier, the LGBTQ plus non-discrimination law about employment and housing. Senate President Mitch Carmichael, you of course have been in support of this, or at least publicly said you're in support of it. You know, I'm more curious about the speaker over there, what your position is on this piece of legislation and where this might go this coming legislative session.
Hold on. Let me just get this real quick. I have not come out in support of this legislation. I just want to clarify that. I am evaluating the various options as it relates to ensuring that we adhere to a non-discrimination policy in the state of West Virginia. We absolutely, and I'll turn the mic over to my friend Roger, but that has been characterized by many in the media as my position because I have been willing to listen to the other side of the argument. And I think that's exactly what a person in leadership role should do. You should listen and try to understand the various perspectives because we live in a society that this has become an issue, and it's incumbent upon us to listen to these other sides. Now, maybe I'll have more to say about this later, but the question was to you, my friend.
Well, it is incumbent that we listen on every policy issue, not this one, but every one. Those points are well taken. Let me respond directly to the question. Where would such a bill go if it's introduced or if it's sent to the House? I don't know. Probably procedurally, it would go to the House Judiciary Committee.
And your position on this issue?
Sure. I think we have to be very careful about creating protected classes, if that's what the bill does. And I've not studied it yet, but if that's what the bill does, we need to, if that's the goal we're out to achieve, we need to make sure there's not unintended consequences to that. I think we have 9 now. I think that if I recall it, the statute right now, it reads 9 protected classes. How many should there be? What should they be if we have more? I am generally hesitant on any bill that creates more protected classes, if that's in fact what the bill does.
Okay, now I'd like to, for my time, Dave may have another question or two follow up, but questions from the floor. And John McCabe from the Wheeling News Register and Intelligencer.
Speaker Hanshaw, it's just a quick question to you. You mentioned in your opening remarks about licensure.
Yes.
Last year, when Delegate Howe introduced the bill, it did not exclude healthcare professionals, which is why it was removed. Will that bill this year exclude healthcare professionals?
It probably will be several bills. So in the scope of the work that the Committee on Government Organizations has done over the interim period, we've looked at several different pieces of the code because it turns out they're not all in Chapter 30 like we often think they are. So the direct and short answer to your question is yes, no one is out to de-license healthcare professionals. That I believe, I don't want to speak for Delegate Howe because he's not here, but I think if he were here, he would tell you that was never the objective of the bill in the first place, even though that may have been how it read. I think what we're talking about here is what we generally describe as sort of the middle skill occupations, folks who want to provide a service to homeowners, folks who have been trained in another state, for example, as roofers, as plumbers, as welders, as upholsterers, which is one of the professions we license in West Virginia. Upholsterers, someone who puts upholstery on sofas and furniture, we license that. Those are the skill gap that I think we're talking about here, not physicians and medical professionals.
Speaker Hanshaw, Mike Meyer from Wheeling. Very specific question. You talked about driver's licenses and you mentioned, quote, administrative process that keeps people from getting driver's licenses. As I understand it, the DMV now has a policy that if you are arrested for DUI, but not convicted, they can and often do suspend or revoke your driver's license. Is that one of the policies that you might look at?
Sir, yes, the direct answer to your direct question is yes. That is one of the policy areas that we would look at.
Thank you.
Speaker Hanshaw, Randy Yohe from West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Have you seen in any research any alternatives to the idea of what to do with people that have been arrested and are awaiting trial and are incarcerated?
I have not, but I can tell you that our House Judiciary Chairman, John Schott, has made this topic area largely his area of study over the summer. So that specific policy area has been his focus over the summer. I'm sorry? Well, other than incarceration, we've specifically begun to look at how do we structure bail in West Virginia. So what guidance can the statute give the trial judges in terms of structuring bail? Can we allow other kinds of collateral to serve as bail? Can we allow employers to somehow vouch for their employees? Nothing's off the table. Nothing's off the table.
Go to Dave for a question.
Yeah, I've heard some rumblings about legislation that would put some further restrictions on abortion rights. But given the 20-week ban and the constitutional amendment passed in 2018, that essentially overturned the Panepinto decision, of course. I'm wondering what else might be on the table with those two things already there.
No, there aren't any other things really on the table. There's the, I think there's a bill that relates to the, basically, I don't even want to call it, I mean, some of these states have adopted what appears to be provisions that allow termination of a pregnancy after birth. And so, which is, I don't even know what to say about that. But so but other than that, there's not really more that we're doing in terms of that issue. So.
Yeah, I'm not aware of another bill.
A question on bringing tech companies to West Virginia. It was mentioned that Boulder, Colorado, because of their recreational opportunities, have an edge. Well, of course, we do indeed have recreational opportunities, but some of the perhaps most attractive ones are in the Potomac Highlands region. My question is, they have the recreational offerings. Do they have the necessary other infrastructure to handle a tech company? And if not, what can we do about it?
Again, let me very specifically answer that question and say no. No, they do not. And that's among the reasons why I have made broadband expansion such a priority. I mean, I've been accused of being a one-trick pony on that issue, and that's okay. I'll wear that badge because that is such an important piece of infrastructure for our state, for the economic future of this state, that we simply have to do it. And we have to do it in places that we otherwise might not think of for exactly the reason you just said. Often we think about the need for internet and tech expansion in our municipalities and in our cities and in our downtowns, and we should do it there, and we have to do it there because the president's right. We need vital cities. We need cities to have a heart and a soul and to be growing and thriving. But we know that the research tells us those tech companies that are looking to leave the West Coast, if they stay domestic, outdoor recreation is one of the principal considerations made by those decision makers. That's data. We don't argue with data. That's what it says. But coming to the places you just described, sir, means that we've got to make sure that those companies can access the internet there. It's as simple as that. It has to be done. We would not argue in the 21st century. In fact, we wouldn't have argued in the 20th century that development of infrastructure and the creation of instrumentalities of commerce was not a vital, absolute, integral, essential role of government. I would in fact argue that infrastructure and public safety are the two principal roles of government. Well, broadband infrastructure is today what the interstate highway was to the 20th century. We have to do it. We have to make sure that the environment is such that private companies can do it, can make returns on investment, can serve all those areas where the companies are likely to go. We have to do it.
I'll just elaborate on that. We are doing a lot in terms of broadband expansion. There's some really exciting things coming down the path with the power companies, AEP and First Energy in our state, because they're exploring, and we authorize them to explore the option of building a middle mile fiber network within their infrastructure of their electrical utilities. And so that is an avenue. We've put additional money into a loan repayment fund, guarantee fund for private sectors to expand into the rural areas of West Virginia. And so we are, and I've paid a big price for wanting to expand broadband in West Virginia. So I know about this business intimately, and it's the density, population density plays a key role in expansion of broadband and making it an economically viable alternative. And so it absolutely needs some support and some backstop from a funding mechanism to really expand into these rural areas. And I'm very glad that we're putting a lot of emphasis on technological expansion of broadband. And it really is not just related to broadband. It's server industry, electrical industry, how the many of these tech companies receive their power. They want a renewable energy source. A lot of those things factor in to what motivates a tech company to locate in West Virginia. So
We'll do Aaron, Damon, and you, Stephen.
I just wanted to follow up on, this is Erin Beck, Register Herald. I just wanted to follow up on Dave's question about the Fairness Act with just a direct yes or no question for both of you. Do you believe that employers and landlords should be able to turn people away because they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? Yes or no?
no.
I don't believe you ought to be able to turn anybody away.
So no?
You shouldn't be able to turn anybody away. That's the point of the protected classes. Shouldn't be able to turn anybody away.
Do you have a legislative solution for ensuring that that happens?
I do not. That's why I said it's a bit of a, it's not as simple as the argument sometimes becomes.
Okay.
Along this issue, I just want to just briefly say that the Supreme Court has this issue right now. And there's an expected ruling toward the end of the year that will identify what you talk about from an employment perspective. And so, we can anticipate some federal guidance on this soon.
Yeah, getting back to Colorado and its recreational activities, there's another recreational activity we're not talking about, and that is they have a $1 billion recreational marijuana business as well. Is there any, and that's part of the draw for young people to go to Colorado. They can go ski and then they go smoke some pot. They also have a great craft brewery industry there. So there's an appeal to young people there that goes beyond going out skiing. Is there any movement in, and there are plenty of places that have figured out the banking issue that seems to have stymied the medical marijuana issue here. Is there going to be any movement towards approving of recreational marijuana in the state?
I personally, I think we got to walk before we can run on that. We haven't even yet gotten our medical program working. So that is a good question, and I do not know the answer to that. As I understand it, there is the task force that is working on it. I don't know the answer to why that's not happened. That is a good question, because we've enacted that statute. It is the law in West Virginia. I do not know the answer to that question.
Help you a little bit is we're on track from a timing perspective as the way it was originally passed. So it's not like there's any hold up that a deadline's not being met. It was just a delayed implementation of the program to begin with. And the rules have been issued. There are bids going out. So we're on track. And I agree with the speaker. Medical marijuana, and I really just don't see West Virginia going down the recreational path. I don't see that at all.
Stephen?
Mr. Speaker, and I would certainly appreciate the President's response to this as well, but you rolled this out to our radio colleagues yesterday and today, and I was kind of hoping that you would talk a little bit about this investment program that you have started talking about in the last 24 hours and explain it, what it does, what you hope it will do, and I would certainly appreciate the President's thoughts on it after you explain it as well.
Absolutely. I'll talk as long about this as people will listen. So we have an absence of capital in the state of West Virginia. We know that a significant impediment to the growth of business and industry in our state is the lack of investment capital that flows here with which to finance the deals. The proposal that I intend to put before the legislature for consideration next week is a proposal to create a vehicle through which other funds and other entities beyond the borders of the state of West Virginia that look for this kind of structure to invest their private capital and their funds capital into the state of West Virginia. It is absolutely as simple as that. We have an opportunity here in West Virginia to capitalize on shale gas resources, the petrochemical industry, the chemical manufacturing base that has historically been part of the economy here in West Virginia in ways that we have never had in the lifetime of anyone here. But doing that means creating a vehicle that allows those investments to be placed. It means creating a vehicle that allows those who are sitting outside the borders of West Virginia that want to deploy their capital in the Marcellus and Utica Shale Basin to do so in a way that lets them feel protected and lets them feel safe. The Mountaineer Impact Fund, as it's envisioned, is a vehicle to do that. It's a vehicle to allow the Mountaineer Impact Fund to be the sponsor of projects for private capital, for other funds, for entities operating outside the borders of West Virginia or outside the borders of the United States of America that want to put their capital here in a safe place, in what's considered to be the safest investment market in the world, and to do so at an economic benefit and an economic return to them. Realize this is not a vehicle that puts the state in a position of choosing which projects succeed and fail. The private capital does that. The private capital has always done that, and it'll continue to do that. But what's necessary is a vehicle to allow it to do so. What's necessary is a vehicle to allow those investments to be made in a manner that lets them feel safe. Realize that economies outside the borders of the United States work differently than ours. Investment decisions get made differently than they're made here. And there are parts of this world in which huge funds, huge sovereign wealth funds, seek the blessing of a local sovereign wealth fund in order to make investments, in order to place economic investments. Some of the largest funds in the world seek this structure. The objective of the Mountaineer Investment Fund is to provide that structure. It's to provide a vehicle to allow those investments to be made here in our state that aren't otherwise going to be made.
The speaker has elaborated on this concept to me several times now, and I'm supportive of it in general. And we have to cross the hurdle of making sure people are aware that this is not socializing, investment decisions with the taxpayers' money in West Virginia. I'm convinced that it's not, and so we just need to make sure people are aware of that.
If I can, we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to, it's executive director privilege, I guess. We're here in the site of the Dome, and we talk about the state's improvements and the financial situation and where we are. But I was in Roane County with Dave Hedges at the paper yesterday, and while Roane County has, I was amazed to find they have an ice rink and a roller rink and a lot of things going on there. Neighboring county that I was told doesn't have a grocery store right now. You have to leave the county to really buy significant groceries. Here in Charleston, our mall at Christmas time had nearly as many stores closed as it did open. We hear how the state's doing better. What do you say to the people on Main Street? And I visit a lot of the papers, and they're out there saying, I don't see it on my Main Street. When can they expect to see that, or what can they expect to see, or is that something that this legislature can address?
Well, certainly there are different perspectives in 1.8 million people in our state. And there are those, we can point to those who are feeling the difference. I've noted Jackson County, how it has really progressed. But there are those there in Jackson County that don't feel that same economic vitality that others do. So there is a disparity among the prosperity of our state. And I believe it does relate to skill sets, training, the opportunity to participate in a vibrant workforce. And we're doing everything we can, Don, to make sure that the people of West Virginia get the training that they need to go to the marketplace and achieve, and to work and to have a job that contributes to the economy at large. And we need more people. West Virginia, is one of the only states in America that's lost population. In fact, the only over the last 50 years. People vote with their feet on how prosperous an economy is, and we need to do everything. Every time we hear these different hurdles that we put in place for people to come to West Virginia, for a job creator to come to West Virginia, we need to do everything we can to knock that down so that people feel good about being in West Virginia and then contributing to the economy. Look at some of the things we've done in terms of our, you talk about veterans. West Virginia has the highest percentage of veterans per capita in America. We eliminated the pension or the tax on pensions, veterans' pensions, so that people will feel more comfortable coming back to West Virginia, living, working, those veterans that can contribute. Things like that make us an attractive place to live, work, and raise a family are the things that we need to pursue. And as our population begins to grow, it just drives growth in the various businesses on Main Street.
So that's my county. That's my county. That was my grocery store that closed. So Clay County at this moment is that county, I assume. I assume.
We were there,
That's me. That's where I live. That's my home. I shop at the Elkview Kroger on the way home every so often when I need to go to the grocery store, and that's the reality of life in our community. So this problem is real. This notion that we are in a crisis situation is still very real to so much of our state. And that's why the urgency that you sometimes hear in my voice when I talk about economic activity and economic development is very real. The notion of economic development, the very term economic development, means something so radically different to people who live in the municipalities in our state than it does to people who live in some of the more rural reaches of West Virginia. It's difficult to describe. I have literally been to a ribbon cutting ceremony for a business hiring 2 people. And you know what? I'm happy to do it, and I'll do it again, because that changes that community. That changes that community. It may not change Charleston, but it changes Grantsville, and it changes Clay, and it changes Glenville, it changes Welch, it changes lots of parts of West Virginia. I'll end by saying this: government can do and should do what it can do. Government ought to do what it can, when it can, where it can. But there's also an absolute need in our state to transform and change our own way of thinking about ourselves and our own situation. We have one of the lowest rates of entrepreneurial activity in the country. We have one of the lowest business startup rates in America. That has to change, and the government can't change that. We can make it easier for people to start a small business, and we're trying to do that. We can make it easier for people who want to grow their business here to do that, and we're trying. But what is much more difficult is convincing someone that it's possible, convincing someone that it's true. And that's where we need the help of all West Virginians. That's where we need people to begin talking about why they've chosen to live here. Why have we chosen to make this our home? Why have we chosen life in this state as opposed to any of the other places that we could choose to be? There's a reason why each and every one of us, why each and every one of you have chosen to make this our home. We have to talk about it, and we have to talk about it more.
And I travel around the state, and certainly that was Clay we were talking about, but there are many other communities in southern West Virginia. When I saw the Walmart close, I was amazed to see a community a regional Walmart closed. In my neighborhood in Charleston, Save-A-Lot closed and boarded up. And to your point, there are some good things happening, but certainly some people, they have a hard time seeing it. With that, I'll close with one final question. You talked about the outdoor activity and different things. Do you think West Virginia will increase its tourism budget this fiscal year?
That's an agenda item for the state Senate, for sure, is to put additional funding into tourism. And I can tell you it has paid big dividends over the past several years. In the past 2 years, traveler spending is up in West Virginia over 9.9%. The growth in traveler spending in West Virginia outpaced the national growth by 58%. We have, and I've got a variety of markers here that indicate tourism growth in West Virginia is very vibrant and expanding, and many in the tourism industry will attribute the extra funding that we put in that program for this success. And when somebody brings a program that's that successful and presents you with the data, say, here's what we did with the money that was allocated before, we grew it this much, can we have some more? They've got a great audience with us.
We largely share that view. The House has discussed this issue. We want to double down on tourism, if for no other reason than what I just said. We need more people talking positively about our state. We know that when tourists come here to visit, they leave here having had a positive experience.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. With that, can I have a round of applause for our panel? We know you're very busy. We appreciate your time. I'm sure you won't make it to the door without getting more questions, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.